Welcome back to The Way of Jesus. So far in this series, we've looked at what it means to be a disciple. We said we need to be prepared for Jesus to transform every area of our lives. We've looked at what it means to love like Jesus in our relationships, to be patient and kind with each other, humble and gentle, to learn how to put others above ourselves. We've looked at the importance of showing grace, of making sure that our words and our actions are aligned. We can't just preach Jesus, we have to live like him as well. And we've looked at forgiveness, how we can learn to let go of the past, to let go of hurt and forgive as we have been forgiven. Or at least try our best, because the way of Jesus is actually really hard. If you haven't been challenged by this series so far, then you're either perfect, in which case congratulations, or perhaps you're not paying close enough attention. Today, as we celebrate harvest, I want us to think about the way in which Jesus showed generosity. How generous are you on a scale of 1 to 10? 10? 5? Less? Last week, both my kids were away for a scout camp, and because we missed them, my wife bought them both a treat, a welcome home present. It was a Project D donut. I don't know if you've had one of these, but they're very nice. And no, they're not sponsoring this video, though if they do want to send me free donuts, I won't complain. Anyway, my daughter came home and she found the donuts in the kitchen, and she looked in each box in order to pick the one that she wanted. And after a minute or two, she declared rather loudly, "I've decided that my brother can have the white chocolate one because I know that it's his favourite." To which my wife replied, "Well, yeah, because the other one's milk chocolate and I know that's your favourite." And then I heard her mutter under her breath this brilliant line. She said, "Yeah, but I wanted the credit for being generous." Kids are sneaky, right? Though I do wonder if sometimes we do the same, whether sometimes we want to be seen to be generous without actually having to be generous. Jesus said, when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So did that mean that Jesus' generosity was quite hard to spot? Well, no, not really. I mean, we only need to look at the cross, right? That's the ultimate act of generosity, as Jesus willingly accepted the collective sin of the world and offered grace and forgiveness in return. There's never been a more generous act than that. But in what other ways do we see the generosity of Jesus? Ways that perhaps we can learn to copy as we learn to be followers of the way. Was he generous with his wealth, with his money? Well, not so much, actually. But then again, Jesus had a very good reason for not being generous with his money. He didn't have any. He said of himself, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." As far as we know, Jesus never had any wealth or property or anything else of value for that matter. His only worldly possessions were his clothes, which were stripped from him at the cross and divided up amongst the soldiers, all except his cloak, which they gambled for. Which begs the question, how did Jesus survive? How did he fund his ministry? Well, the fact of the matter was, Jesus was reliant upon the generosity of others. As he travelled around from place to place, he would stay in the homes of those who were willing to put him up, to look after him. Look at the advice that he gave to his disciples. He said, "Take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt." Certainly not how I packed for my kids' scout camp. I made sure they had extra everything. He said, "Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town." I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where someone has come into your house but doesn't seem to want to leave. It can get kind of awkward. You end up dropping all these hints like, well, it's getting kind of late, and haven't you got an early start tomorrow? And they just sit there smiling, asking for another cup of tea. I remember the early days of my life group when everyone was a lot younger. No one would ever leave my house before midnight. In fact, on one occasion, I went upstairs, I ran myself a bath, I had the bath, and then I got into my pajamas and came back downstairs, and there were still people there talking. But it was fine. I love my life group. But that was Jesus' whole ministry model. He was totally dependent upon the generosity of others. In fact, he even had some patrons, those that were supporting him financially, presumably through his first century GoFundMe page. But you can read about them in Luke 8. There was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, who is the wife of Chusa, who managed Herod's household, and Susanna. And it says in Luke 8 that Mary, Joe and Sue helped to support Jesus out of their own means. That's why I have no problem at all with my wife making more than me. It's completely biblical. But if it's good enough for Jesus to mooch off others, then surely that's good enough for us too, right? We can expect others to support us, to take care of us, to feed us. Yeah. As long as we don't have money or property of our own. Otherwise, we should be the ones looking to support those who have none. You see, Jesus' relative poverty gave him the authority to say to others, if you want to be perfect, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and then you will have treasure in heaven. Now, you can't make that kind of commandment if you yourself are rolling in the Benjamins, can you? And although Jesus didn't have any cash, he wasn't exactly stingy with what he did have, was he? When he fed the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and 2 fish gifted to him by the small boy, he did it in such a way that there were 12 baskets of leftovers left over. When he turned the 6 stone water jars into booze for the wedding at Cana, he turned it into the finest wine around, not that cheap stuff you get at Spa for a £5. When he helped Peter catch some fish, he didn't just give him enough for breakfast. He gave him so many that the boat began to sink. They had fish fingers for months after that. Jesus, he always went big. It was almost as though he was trying to teach us something about the generosity of God. On one occasion, he said, if you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? How much more will your Father give good gifts? Jesus was so generous. He was generous with his time as well. One of the things that always seemed to surprise people was just how much time he gave to others, especially those who were not like him. One of my favourite stories is found in John 4, where Jesus goes out of his way to have a conversation with a Samaritan woman. Not only was it frowned upon to talk to women in public in those days, those that weren't your wife anyway, in Jesus' circle, everyone thought Samaritans were the bad guys. Jesus hadn't told them the story of the good Samaritan yet. But that's why it says in verse 27, when the disciples returned, they were surprised to see him talking to a woman. But Jesus had time. He had time for everybody that needed him. He spotted Zacchaeus up the tree. He heard blind Bartimaeus calling to him out of the crowd. He was even aware of that woman that touched the hem of his cloak, desperate for healing. Or another one of my favourites, when he spotted that grieving mother in the middle of the funeral procession. And it says his heart went out to her. It was like Jesus had this antenna for those who were hurting and broken. And every single time he makes a beeline for them, no matter what else is going on. You know, I'm not great at that. Sometimes when I see someone upset, I go in the opposite direction and make excuses for myself. Like, oh, I'm just giving them space, or I don't know what to say. Sometimes I don't even notice when people are upset. But Jesus always did. He was so generous with what he had, generous with his time, generous with his heart. And I think his expectation is that we would learn this kind of generosity too. Just think about some of the stories that he told, like the story of the prodigal son. You know that one, right? It's the son, and he wants his father's inheritance because he can't really be bothered to wait for his father to die like everybody else. And so he asks for it. And when the father generously gives it to him, he goes and spends the whole lot living it up in the city. But inevitably the money runs out and he ends up destitute, stealing food from pigs just to keep from starving. And he thinks, well, I could go home and I could grovel to my father, and if I do it well enough, he might allow me to be a servant in his home. But before he's even reached his old house, his father spots him and runs towards him, and he throws his arms around him and he hugs him and he kisses him, and he puts this robe on his shoulders and he puts a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and he arranges this huge feast in celebration. It's this incredible act of generosity in the face of rejection and disrespect. And what about the story of the workers in the vineyard? That wealthy landowner that goes out to the marketplace early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard, and he agrees to pay them a day's wage. But then he goes back again, doesn't he, at 9, and he finds other workers and he agrees to pay them what's fair. And then he goes back again at noon, and again at 3, and again at 5. And each time he hires workers and he agrees to pay them what they deserve. But then at the end of the day, he gathers all of the workers in the vineyard and he lines them up, beginning with the last to be hired, and he pays them all the exact same wage. Imagine turning up to work at 4:30 in the afternoon and receiving a full day's wage. That's outrageously generous. It's probably quite bad for business too. What about the story of the Good Samaritan that I mentioned earlier? You know, when this Samaritan saw a man stripped and beaten, he immediately went over to him and he healed his wounds. He bandaged them up. It says he poured oil and wine on them, which I assume is some sort of first century disinfectant. But he didn't just stop there, did he? He put the man on the back of his donkey and he carried him all the way to an inn, and then he paid for his stay. And he said to the innkeeper, mate, please look after him. And when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expense that you might have. He made sure that this total stranger had the best possible care. Essentially paid for private, right? Jesus' stories, they were chocked full of characters that displayed this outrageous generosity, often at great cost to themselves. But there is another dimension to these stories, because each of them contains a character that simply couldn't get on board with this kind of generosity. Someone, we might even say, found this kind of generosity offensive. In the story of the prodigal son, it's the older brother. You see, when he heard that his sibling had returned and that his father was throwing him a party, he became angry. He refused to go into the house and he refused to join in the celebrations. And he complains to his father. He says, all these years I've been slaving for you and I've never disobeyed your orders, and yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, notice that phrase, son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitute comes home, you killed the fattened calf for him. You see, the older son is offended because his father's generosity is undeserved. And he's kind of right. You know, the younger son, he's not done anything to deserve this special kind of treatment. He's already had one massive handout from his father and he just squandered it on sex, drugs and whatever music was popular in the first century. And yet, here is the father willing to give even more willing to give even when it's undeserved. I wonder, do we ever allow our judgment of others to get in the way of our generosity? Do we ever look at someone in need and think, oh, I better not give them money, they're only going to go and waste it? Or, wow, they don't deserve my money that I've worked hard for. They need to go sort themselves out, not be constantly on the lookout for handouts. In the story, the father's only real concern is that in this moment his son feels loved and accepted and as though he had a home. And he said to his eldest, my son, you are always with me and everything that I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours, notice that reversal, not son of mine, brother of yours, was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. Let me ask you, which do you think communicates the love of God better? Generosity or judgment? In the story of the workers in the vineyard, it was the ones who were hired earlier on in the day that ended up being the complainers. As they watched the workers who were hired last receive a full day's wage, they thought to themselves, hey, that means we're going to get more. You know, we were here first, we should get a bigger share of the day's earnings. But they didn't. They all got exactly the same. And rather than being grateful for their employment and their wage packet, they went and found the landowner to complain. And they said, you know, those who were hired last, they worked only 1 hour. And you have made them equal to us, who have bore the burden of the work and the heat of the day. What's that about? What are you thinking? And again, I suppose their complaints were valid, weren't they? I mean, they had worked harder, we assume. Certainly they'd worked longer. They were paid fairly, but even if they didn't deserve more, then surely the others deserved less. It's not like it was their fault that the other workers had spent all day hanging out in the marketplace rather than looking for work, was it? And yet this landowner gave them a full day's wage. I wonder, do we ever allow our jealousy to get in the way of our generosity? Do we ever look at others and think, I deserve more because I work harder and I work longer? Others don't deserve my generosity. They haven't been through what I've been through. But the landowner said to them, I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a day's wages? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. And don't I have the right to do what I want with my money? Or are you envious because I am generous? Let me ask, which do you think communicates the love of God better? Jealousy or generosity? In the story of the Good Samaritan, the complainers didn't come at the end, but rather the start. We see Jesus talking about a priest and a Levite who noticed the man beaten and bloody, but choose to pass by on the other side of the road. Priest and a Levite, they both work in the temple. And so if we were looking for a modern day Christian equivalent, we might call them a pastor and a worship leader. And in the story, Jesus doesn't tell us why they chose not to help, but it was widely known that the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along at all. And so we assume that their internal monologue went something like this. Oh gosh, that poor chap over there. Oh, wait, is that a Samaritan? Well, never mind then, no. They probably deserved it. Or if we want to be perhaps a bit more generous to them, maybe it went something like this. Oh gosh, that poor chap over there. Oh, I'd love to stop and help, but I think it's a Samaritan and I better not be seen to be helping them because others might think less of me. Or maybe they just thought, oh, I could help, but I'm busy. You know, I've got more important things to do and I don't want to get blood on my robes before I go to worship, do I? But whether it was prejudice, fear, or apathy, or maybe all three, the results were the same: a distinct lack of generosity. Who communicated the love of God better, the Samaritan or the other two? Jesus told some challenging stories, didn't he? And they're challenging because they cause us to ask ourselves, which character am I? Who best represents me? Am I the generous father who gives freely to his son, even though he's hurt him in the past? Or am I the judgmental brother who, despite having had all of my needs met, cannot celebrate the generosity of my father? Am I the generous landowner who's constantly on the lookout for those in need, joyously giving more than they have earned? Or am I the jealous worker who, despite having received a good wage, still thinks I deserve more? Or perhaps more importantly, that others deserve less? Am I the generous Samaritan who goes above and beyond for those who are broken and hurting, even at great cost to myself? Or am I the priest and the Levite who want nothing to do with people like that because I'm far too busy and important? Probably, like me, you think of yourself as somewhere in the middle. But which way are we leaning? Towards generosity or towards judgment, jealousy, prejudice and apathy? Because if we're honest, I think there's lots of things that we allow to get in the way of us being generous, aren't there? I wonder if at the moment fear might be one of our biggest barriers. You know, we're in the middle of this cost of living crisis, aren't we? We're all tightening our belts and maybe wondering how we're going to make it through the winter. If you happen to pass my office, it's at the front of my house, and if you peer through the window, you'll probably see me sitting here in an hoodie with a woolly hat on because I'm trying to avoid turning the heating on at the moment. But whilst I know there are some of us who really are struggling, and if that is you, I want you to know that we're here for you. Whatever you need, please get in touch with the church. I also know that there are many of us who will be just fine. And what we have to do is make sure that our fear of what might happen tomorrow doesn't prevent us from being generous today. I wonder if sometimes our fear is actually a lack of trust that God will take care of us. Paul writes in the book of Acts, "You yourselves know that these hands of mine have supplied my own needs and the needs of my companions. In everything I did, I showed that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself, who said it is more blessed to give than receive." I pray that we continue to know the truth of those words at this time. Let me finish with the words of John Wesley. He wrote, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can." I think that is the best way to demonstrate the love of God and the generosity of Jesus.